Hello everyone. So friend, in this lecture we'll see the demonstration of how to use dynamic container for writing our dynamic test. In our previous lecture we discussed that dynamic container is basically container composed of dynamic test and other dynamic container, and this chain can go on till we have a dynamic container which only contains the dynamic test. So here basically dynamic container contains a collection of dynamic nodes. Now as we discussed, the dynamic node is parent to dynamic test and dynamic container. So inside a dynamic container we can have multiple dynamic tests along with other dynamic container which can go on and on. So friend, let's go to Eclipse and see the demonstration of how we can create a dynamic container for our dynamic test. So here in our dynamic test demo class, here we'll create a test factory. Now this test factory will demonstrate how we can use dynamic containers in our JUnit test cases. So here we are simply returning a stream of dynamic node and we'll give the test name as dynamic test with dynamic containers. Here we'll import the dynamic node which is parent to dynamic container class. So friends, here we'll create a dynamic container which will consist of other dynamic containers and dynamic test. So let's say if we are using this input list having 4 strings. So here we need to return a stream of dynamic node. So what we can do is, let's say for providing the dynamic nature, we use this create input list method. It will return us a list of string. So here what we do is we create a stream out of it, and as soon as we get the hold of the stream, what we do is we use the map method, and let's say for each and every input race, mom, dad and test, we are mapping this input to a dynamic container. So the method to create a dynamic container is using the static method present in dynamic container class. So either we can use dynamic container dot dynamic container, or we can simply do a static import. And here if you see, the dynamic container takes in a display name, and you can see it takes a stream of the dynamic nodes, which is nothing but composition of dynamic test and dynamic containers together. So here let's say we provide a display name as, let's say here we are performing test on this input list and we are mapping an input to a dynamic container. So here we are giving the container for input, and here as second argument takes a stream of dynamic nodes. What we can do is we can use stream dot off, and here we can provide a stream of dynamic test plus dynamic containers, because this is a stream of dynamic nodes, and as dynamic node is parent to dynamic container and dynamic test. So here as we have created container for each and every string present here, what we can do is first we can simply provide a dynamic test to simply check for not null stuff. We'll import assert not null. So here this dynamic test has a display name and an executable. So here the dynamic container contains one dynamic test. So here For each string, this dynamic container has a dynamic test which simply asserts that it's not null. So here if I run the test case, so here you can see that for 4 strings, 4 containers spawned and each container executed not null. On the respective strings. So let's say it got executed successfully. Now what we can do is, we have provided a dynamic test inside a container. Let's say we provide one more container. So it's nothing but a nesting of containers. So here inside this dynamic container, the display name we provide is let's say after checking for not null, we check for its properties. And here we provide a stream of more dynamic tests. So here inside this dynamic container, we can provide now multiple tests. So let's say first we provide the dynamic test that length should be greater than 0 as a display name. So here we provide assert true. We give input.length. To be greater than 0. We'll import assert true. So friends, here you can see the length of each string is greater than 0. So here inside this test, we are simply asserting for its length to be greater than 0. And let's say we provide one more dynamic test. So I simply copy this. And let's say here I test for not empty. And here I simply provide assert false. And inside assert false I provide is empty. So we'll import assert false from assertions package. So friends, here you can see that from list of input strings, we created a stream. Then we mapped each and every input like race, mom, dad and test to a dynamic container. And inside the dynamic container, we provided a stream of first a dynamic test. We simply tested for not null for the input string. And then we provided yet another container. We simply provided the test on the properties like the length should be greater than 0 and it should not be empty. So friend, here you can see that we have created a nested of test for each and every string here. So if I run the test case now, so here if you see that this is our test. So first, as the input list contained 4 string, 4 containers were created. And for each string, first it was checked that whether it's null or not. And then yet another container was spawned to check the length should be greater than 0 and it should not be empty. And similarly, for each string, the nesting of testers were created. So here if you see that overall 12 test cases were created. 4 for checking not null and 8 for checking the length greater than 0 and not empty. So friend, basic idea behind creating dynamic container is we can create the nested test having one dynamic container inside other dynamic container. And friend, this chain can go on till we have one dynamic container with only dynamic tests. So friend, let's suppose if we fail one of the dynamic tests. So here if I simply do assert false, that input.length is greater than 0 is false. So if I run the test case, so friends, here you can see that not null ran successfully, not empty ran successfully, but for each container the length greater than 0 test case failed, giving an assertion failed error that expected false but was true. So here you can see that for each inner container one of our test case failed. So in overall we had this 4 string, so 4 test case failed and rest of the 8 test cases got executed successfully. So friend, this was all about how we can use dynamic containers to create the dynamic test. I hope you like this video. Thanks, have a nice day.